Right now, somewhere, a parent is taking a phone away from their teenager because of how many hours a day they spent on it. And the strange truth is, that number, the one everyone fixates on, the one that starts every argument about screens, might be telling them almost nothing useful at all. Researchers spent years trying to prove that time on social media was the thing destroying young people's well-being. They expected to find a clean, simple line: more hours online, more harm done. They did not find that line, and the evidence changes everything. For a long time, the assumption seemed obvious enough that nobody thought to question it. If a teenager was struggling, you looked at their screen time. If the number was high, you had your explanation. It felt like common sense, the kind of thing that doesn't need testing because it's just clearly true. Spend more time somewhere, and that place has more power over you. Spend more time scrolling, and scrolling has more power over your mind. But when scientists actually went looking for that pattern across large groups of people, it kept failing to show up. Several major reviews of the research found only a small, inconsistent link between time spent on social media and things like depression or loneliness in young people. Some very large studies, ones that tracked real, detailed records of how teenagers spent their days, found barely any negative effect of screen time on well-being at all. The number everyone was watching, the hours per day, the minutes per scroll, turned out to be a surprisingly weak predictor of who was actually struggling. So a group of researchers in Italy decided to look closer, and they looked in a way most studies hadn't. Instead of asking a single group of teenagers once how they felt and how much they used their phones, they followed 403 adolescents, ages 13 to 18, across 4 separate points in time, spanning about 7 months. At each point, the teenagers reported how addicted to social media they felt, based on a validated scale researchers use to measure that. Their phones, not their memory, reported how many hours they actually spent on Instagram and on TikTok each day, pulled directly from their devices. And alongside all of that, the researchers measured something most studies on screen time leave out entirely: how emotionally regulated each teenager was, how much social support they felt they had in their real offline life, and how much they compared themselves to other people online. This wasn't a one-time snapshot. It was a search for a pattern over time, a way to see not just how teenagers were doing, but how their relationship with social media moved and changed across months of ordinary life. What they found split the teenagers into 3 distinct groups, and the shape of those groups is where this gets genuinely surprising. The first group, making up just over half of all the teenagers studied, looked exactly like what you'd hope to see: low scores on the addiction measure, the fewest hours spent on Instagram and TikTok, a healthy, low-friction relationship with their phones. Call this the steady group. The second group is the one that should worry you, but maybe not for the reason you'd guess. About a quarter of the teenagers fell into this group, and they had the highest addiction scores of anyone in the study, along with the most hours spent on TikTok, somewhere around 4.5 hours a day. This is the group researchers called the most vulnerable. And then there's the third group, about 16% of the teenagers. And this is the one that breaks the assumption wide open. These teenagers spent the most time of anyone in the entire study on Instagram, nearly 6 hours a day on average, more screen time than even the most vulnerable group. And yet their addiction scores were only moderate, noticeably lower than the most vulnerable groups. They were the heaviest users of all by raw hours, and they were not the most at-risk group. Researchers ended up calling them simply the engaged group. Sit with that for a second. The teenagers spending the most time on their phones were not the ones in the most trouble. If you had to guess which teenager needed help based purely on how many hours a day they were online, you would have picked the wrong one. So if hours weren't the deciding factor, what was? When researchers compared the most vulnerable group to the steady, healthy group, 4 things stood out. The vulnerable teenagers were more likely to be female. They scored higher on a measure of how often they compared their social life and popularity to other people online. They used social media more intensely, meaning they checked it, liked things, and messaged people more frequently, not just for longer stretches. And they reported having less social support in their actual offline lives. Each of these stood out on its own, independent of how many hours they'd spent scrolling. Then, the researchers did something even more revealing. They compared the most vulnerable group directly against the engaged group, the heavy Instagram users who weren't struggling nearly as much. Both groups spent a lot of time on social media. So what separated them? It came down to 3 things again, and raw screen time was not one of them. The vulnerable group had more trouble regulating their emotions. They compared themselves to others online more often, and they had less support waiting for them offline. Time on the app didn't separate these 2 groups. The way they were using that time and what they had waiting for them when they put the phone down did. There's one more detail in this study that deserves its own moment because it quietly undercuts something a lot of people assume about an addiction score. 2 of the 3 groups in this study, the vulnerable group and the engaged group, scored in the exact same range on the social media addiction scale researchers used. The same range. A moderate risk score on a checklist looked identical for a teenager who was emotionally struggling and isolated, and for a teenager who was simply spending a lot of time on an app they enjoyed, with a solid support system behind them. If you only had that one number, that addiction score, you genuinely could not have told these 2 teenagers apart. One score, 2 very different lives. And there's a final piece worth knowing because it changes how permanent this all feels. For some teenagers in the study, those addiction scores actually shifted over the course of just a few weeks or months. This wasn't a fixed trait carved into who they were. It moved. Researchers suspect things like a stretch of feeling rejected by peers or a temporary swing in popularity might be enough to nudge those numbers up or down in the short term. A rough patch with a phone is not necessarily a permanent identity. So here's what all of this actually means for you. Whether you're the teenager in question, the parent worried about one, or just someone trying to understand your own relationship with your phone. Stop using hours per day as your warning sign. It is, on its own, almost useless as a measure of whether someone is in trouble. A person can spend 6 hours a day on Instagram and be doing better than someone spending half that time on TikTok. The number alone tells you almost nothing about which one of them needs help. Instead, pay attention to 3 quieter, harder to measure things. First, how much is this person comparing their life, their popularity, their body, their social standing to everyone else's curated highlight reel? That comparing habit showed up again and again as a real warning sign, far more consistently than time spent. Second, how well does this person handle difficult emotions when they're not on their phone at all? Struggling to regulate feelings was one of the clearest differences between the group that was actually struggling and the group that simply used their phone a lot. And third, and maybe most important, does this person have real support waiting for them when they log off? Friends, family, people they can talk to face to face. Lower offline support was one of the most consistent predictors of being in the at-risk group, appearing again and again across every comparison the researchers ran. If you've ever judged your own relationship with your phone purely by counting hours, or felt guilty about a number on a screen time app, you might be measuring the wrong thing entirely. The real question was never how much time you spent. It's what you were doing in that time, and who and what you had waiting for you when you put the phone down. And if you've had a rough stretch with it lately, that doesn't make it your permanent story. It might just be a phase that's already starting to pass. Somewhere, a parent is still taking a phone away from their teenager, counting hours as if hours were the answer. And the strange truth is, the answer was never in the hours at all.